Surface Tension by Agnes Pockels. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in April 2020. Surface Tension by Agnes Pockels. From Nature, number 1115, volume 43, March 13, 1891. I shall be obliged if you can find space for the accompanying translation of an interesting letter which I have received from a German lady, who, with very homely appliances, has arrived at valuable results respecting the behavior of contaminated water surfaces. The earlier part of Miss Pockels' letter covers nearly the same ground as some of my own recent work, and in the main harmonizes with it. The latter sections seem to me very suggestive, raising, if they do not fully answer, many important questions. I hope soon to find opportunity for repeating some of Miss Pockels' experiments. Rayleigh, March 2nd. Brunswick, January 10th. My Lord, will you kindly excuse my venturing to trouble you with a German letter on a scientific subject? Having heard of the fruitful researches carried on by you last year on the hitherto little understood properties of water surfaces, I thought it might interest you to know of my own observations on the subject. For various reasons I am not in a position to publish them in scientific periodicals, and I therefore adopt this means of communicating to you the most important of them. First, I will describe a simple method which I have employed for several years for increasing or diminishing the surface of a liquid in any proportion, by which its purity may be altered at pleasure. A rectangular tin trough, 70 cm long, 5 cm wide, 2 cm high, is filled with water to the brim, and a strip of tin about 1½ cm wide laid across it perpendicular to its length, so that the underside of the strip is in contact with the surface of the water and divides it into two halves. By shifting this partition to the right or the left, the surface on either side can be lengthened or shortened in any proportion, and the amount of the displacement may be read off on a scale held along the front of the trough. No doubt this apparatus suffers, as I shall point out presently, from a certain imperfection, for the partition never completely shuts off the two separate surfaces from each other. If there is a great difference of tension between the two sides, a return current often breaks through between the partition and the edge of the trough, particularly at the time of shifting. The apparatus, however, answers for attaining any condition of tension which is at all possible, and in experiments with very clean surfaces there is little to be feared in the way of currents breaking through. I always measured the surface tension in any part of the trough by the weight necessary to separate from it a small disc, 6 mm in diameter, for which I used a light balance with unequal arms and a sliding weight. I will now put together the most important results obtained with this apparatus, most of which, though perhaps not all, must be known to you. 1. Behavior of the surface tension of water. The surface tension of a strongly contaminated water surface is variable, that is, it varies with the size of the surface. The minimum of the separating weight attained by diminishing the surface is to the maximum, according to my balance, in the ratio of 52 to 100. If the surface is further extended, after the maximum tension is attained, the separating weight remains constant, as with oil, spirits of wine, and other normal liquids. It begins, however, to diminish again, directly the partition is pushed back to the point of the scale at which the increase of tension ceased. The water surface can thus exist in two sharply contrasted conditions: the normal condition, in which the displacement of the partition makes no impression on the tension, and the anomalous condition, in which every increase or decrease alters the tension. 2. Mobility. Upon the purity of the surface depends its mobility, and in consequence the persistence of a wave once set in motion. So long, however, as the water surface is in its anomalous condition, the damping of the waves is constant, and just at the degree of purity at which the tension ceases to alter, the decrease of the damping begins. Footnote. This is not quite exact. I found the number of visible passages constant equals 3 in the anomalous state, but the velocity of transmission varying in some degree with the tension, the time required for the vanishing of the wave must really become a little longer when the tension is lowered. February 26. End footnote. If the balance is loaded with just the maximum weight which the surface tension can hold, and the normal surface is contracted till the weight breaks away, a measure is obtained of the relative amount of contamination by the ratio of the length of the surface before and after contraction. For the purer the surface, the smaller must be the fraction to which it is reduced before it begins to enter the anomalous state. By counting, with different relative contaminations, how often a wave excited by a small rod at the end of the trough passed along the surface adjusted to a length of 30 centimeters before it ceased to be visible, I obtained approximately the following values for the number of the passages. Relative contamination, 0. Number of visible wave passages, 17. Relative contamination, 5. Number of visible wave passages, 17. Relative contamination, 10. Number of visible wave passages, 17. Relative contamination, 15. Number of visible wave passages, 17. Relative contamination, 20. Number of visible wave passages, 12. Relative contamination, 25. Number of visible wave passages, 8. Relative contamination, 30. Number of visible wave passages, 3. The numbers of the upper row indicate the length at which the surface becomes anomalous in 1/30ths of its whole length. Those of the second row are, as may be imagined, rather uncertain, particularly the greater ones, although they are the mean of many observations. A perfectly clean surface, whose tension remains constant even under the greatest contraction, can be approximately produced with the adjustable trough, by placing the partition quite at the end and pushing it from thence to the middle. The surface on one side is thus formed entirely afresh from the interior of the liquid. 3. Effect on a water surface of contact with solid bodies. Every solid body, however clean, which is brought in contact with a newly formed surface, contaminates it more or less decidedly, according to the substance of which the body consists. With many substances, such as camphor or flour, this effect is so strong that the tension of the surface is lowered to a definite value. With others, glass, metals, it is only shown by the increase of relative contamination. The contaminating current which goes out from the circumference of a body, for example of a floating fragment of tin foil, is easily made visible by dusting the water with lycopodium or flowers of sulfur. I will call it, for the sake of brevity, the solution current. The solution current of a body which is introduced into a perfectly clean water surface lasts until the relative contamination produced by it has attained a definite value, which is different for every substance. Thus, the solution current for wax ceases at a relative contamination of 0.55, that of tin foil at a still smaller one, but that of camphor not until the surface has become decidedly anomalous, and the separating weight gone down to within 0.80 of the maximum. If, on the other hand, the surface surrounding a small piece of tinfoil be restored to its previous purity, the current begins again with renewed strength, and it appears that this process may be repeated as often as desired, without the solution current ever quite disappearing. From this effect of the contact of solid bodies, it follows that a perfectly pure surface cannot be maintained for long in any vessel, since every vessel will contaminate it. Whether the air and the matter contained in it have a share in the gradual increase of relative contamination which occurs on water left standing, I know not, but the influence of gases and vapors does not appear to me important in general. The contamination by the sides of the vessel does not, however, always go so far as to diminish the tension, which remains normal, for example, in a glass of water, after 4 days standing. With a rising temperature, the contamination from all substances seems to increase considerably, but I have not yet investigated this in detail. 4. Currents between surfaces of equal tension. Between two normal surfaces, which are unequally contaminated by one and the same substance, a current sets in from the more to the less contaminated when the partition is removed, much weaker indeed than that exhibited in the anomalous condition by differences of tension, but all the same distinctly perceptible. With equal relative contamination by the same substance, no current of course sets in. It is otherwise when the contamination is produced by different substances. I contaminated the surface on one side of the partition by repeated immersion of a metal plate, on the other by immersion of a glass plate, which had both been previously carefully cleaned and repeatedly immersed in fresh water surfaces. I then made the relative contamination on the two sides equal, that is, 1/2, by pushing in the outer partitions by which the surfaces were enclosed. After the water had been dusted with lycopodium, the middle partition was removed. I repeated this experiment 8 times, with different changes devised as checks. On the removal of the partition, a decided current set in each time, from the surface contaminated by glass to that contaminated by metal, and when I replaced the partition after the current had ceased and investigated the contamination on both sides, I always found it greater on the metal than on the glass side. Thus, equal relative contamination by different substances does not indicate equality of that osmotic pressure which is the cause of the current between surfaces of equal tension. For further proof of this result, I have made experiments with other substances, for example, with a floating piece of tinfoil on one side and of wax on the other, when, after they had been acting for a long time, and then the relative contaminations had been equalized, a current resulted from the wax to the tinfoil, and again, with camphor on the one and small pieces of wood and wax on the other side, which showed a current from the wax and wood to the camphor. Since, therefore, the water surface assumes dissimilar qualities from contact with different substances, the conviction is forced upon me that it is these bodies themselves, glass, metal, wax, etc., which are dissolved, though only feebly, in the surface, and thereby render it capable under sufficient contraction of becoming anomalous. 5. Further observations on solution currents. The following facts agree with this view. If a newly formed water surface be contaminated by small floating slices of wax until the latter cease to give solution currents, the relative contamination amounts to 0.55. If now another fresh surface is brought to the same relative contamination by tin foil and a corresponding contraction, and then a slice of wax from the first surface be introduced, it will develop a considerable solution current. This therefore depends on the substance with which the surrounding surface was previously contaminated. Substances which are properly soluble in water, such as sugar and soda, exhibit a similar behavior when immersed in the surface, only they continue to act in the anomalous condition. A crystal of sugar placed in a normal but not perfectly pure surface produces a great fall of tension. If the surface be then made normal again by immersing and withdrawing strips of paper, and if this process be repeated several times, a normal surface is at last attained, which is contaminated by sugar only, and on the tension of this the sugar produces no further effect. A piece of soda held in the surface containing sugar greatly lowers the tension, and on the other hand, on a surface rendered repeatedly anomalous by soda, soda acts but slightly, and sugar powerfully. In this experiment, the sugar and soda crystals being instantly wetted, they do not really act by solution currents, for the latter can only be produced by a dry body. The action here is an indirect one by intervention of the deeper layers. February 26. 6. Behavior of the surfaces of solutions. The effect of soluble matter on the surface tension has absolutely nothing to do with the change which the cohesion of the water undergoes through matter dissolved in the body of the liquid, for both sugar and soda solutions have a higher maximum tension than pure water, and yet these same substances introduced into the surface produce a fall in the separating weight. In order to investigate the behavior of the surfaces of solutions more closely, I introduced the saturated solution of common salt into the adjustable trough. The freshly formed surface of the solution of salt maintained its normal separating weight, 1.154 of that of water, even when most contracted, though it must necessarily have contained as much salt as the interior of the liquid. The entrance of the anomalous condition, then, does not depend on the absolute quantity of the contaminating substance contained in the surface, but when I placed some salt in contact with the normal surface of the saturated solution, it gave a solution current and lowered the tension, as in the case of pure water. I obtained similar results with a solution of sugar. From these experiments I concluded a. That the surface layer of water can take up more of soluble substances than the internal liquid, b. That the surface of a solution is capable of becoming anomalous under contraction, always and only when it contains more of the dissolved substance than the interior of the liquid. That the surface layer really possesses a higher dissolving power is further shown by the experiment, which is well known to you, in which a thin disk of camphor, so hung that it is half immersed in the cleanest possible water surface, is cut through in the course of a few hours. I will add, by the way, that a newly formed surface of a saturated solution of camphor is normal according to my observations, that is, that its tension remains nearly constant under contraction, and that small pieces of camphor floating on it still give solution streams and have slight motions. The solution stream seems in this case to cease just when the surface begins to be anomalous. What I have further observed regarding solutions in the surface and the like seems to me less remarkable, and in part of it still very uncertain. I therefore confine myself to these short indications, but I believe that much might be discovered in this field if it were thoroughly investigated. I thought I ought not to withhold from you these facts which I have observed, although I am not a professional physicist, And again begging you to excuse my boldness, I remain, with sincere respect, yours faithfully, Agnes Pockles. End of Surface Tension by Agnes Pockles.
Tactless People by Anna Cora Mawat Ritchie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. We believe it is generally admitted that the most agreeable associates in the everyday intercourse of society are those who put us in a good humor with ourselves. Tactless people have a wonderful faculty of effecting the very opposite. However well-tuned may be the instrument they touch, their rough, inconsequent fingers always strike some jarring string. Wounded sensibility exaggerates their bluntness into insult. Confusion enters the doors where they pass in. Discord follows in their steps. There is an anecdote told of a certain officer who, having lost an arm in battle, ever after judged of the high breeding and good nature of the persons presented to him by noticing whether their eyes wandered to the empty coat sleeve. He knew that those who appeared perfectly unconscious of his loss were influenced by considerate delicacy, while those whose eyes were constantly turned to the former locality of the deficient member had souls of a rude texture, insensible to fine perceptions or sympathetic emotions. Tactless people belong to this last-mentioned order of beings, and seem to possess an especial gift of spying out and pitiless dragging to light imperfections which politeness ignores. Their scrutinizing eyes are ever upon a voyage of discovery, and who does not shrink from their merciless scanning? Who has not felt that being observed when observation is not sympathy is just being tortured? Yet from this torture we never need hope to escape while a member, especially a feminine member, of the tactless family is present. Be sure that her lynx eyes will detect the first unwelcome thread of silver that winds its shining way among raven locks, and will as certainly proclaim the unsuspected intruder. But she makes the announcement with no malicious intent. She is quite unconscious of wounding one, yet unreconciled to the sore necessity of growing old. Your tactless friend seems physically unable to avoid personalities. Let a pair of smiling lips disclose pearls of striking unnatural whiteness and regularity, and she is immediately impelled to descant upon false teeth. She unfailingly discusses the angularity and grace of meager people before those who are vainly seeking flesh in cod liver oil, and every other known promoter of rounded outlines, and she invariably expresses her disgust for unseemly rotundity before unfortunates who are martyrizing themselves by futile efforts to reduce their unsymmetrical proportion through compression and starvation, or to conceal them by manifold arts of the toilette. Tactless people are especially given to criticize dress. Woe to the hapless fair one who has been forced by poverty into some little untasteful expedient, or who bears about her a darn or a slight fracture which she nervously hoped might escape notice. Be all on peradventure a pair of rebuking, tactless eyes will forthwith fasten upon the imperfection. Beware, too, the hands of the tactless. They are human magnets to attract and draw out defects. if a vase of flowers is turned to the wall to hide an unsightly crack, if a cushion is arranged on the sofa to conceal an unlucky rent, if a curtain is adjusted over a window to veil a broken pane, if a footstool is carefully placed over an oil stain on the carpet, their hands, as if by instinct, drag away the friendly screen and reveal the hidden offense. As for French gold and plated silver and paste diamonds and imitation lace, dyed silks, cleaned gloves, and other genteel shams and expedients, there is not the faintest chance that they will pass current with your tactless guest. If perforce her lips are silent, the close investigation and significant glances of her telltale eyes quickly announce that she is not duped by the imposture. Then, if there is a sore subject to anyone present, it is always stumbled upon, though with no unkind intention, by these tactless people. They will discourse about profligate sons and thankless daughters before sorrowing parents, and rail at unworthy husbands before heartbroken wives, and bemoan the wretchedness of marriage before ill-matched partners. If a girl has been jilted, they innocently endeavor to entertain her with an account of the wedding of a gay young friend. If a sick child lies gasping in its mother's arms, the consolation they offer is a history of the deaths they have known from just such illnesses. They are very much surprised if an impression slowly reaches them that they have created confusion or occasioned distress. They assure you that they had no such design, and doubtless they had none. It was only the absence of that sixth sense called tact, which rendered them so obnoxious as companions, and which always will cause their presence to be dreaded and shunned. Singularly enough, their own sensibilities are remarkably acute. No one can be more quickly wounded than they, if their blunt speeches are retorted, and the arrows sent back hit their own vulnerable points. Do we estimate tact too highly in thinking it a positive virtue, one of the indispensable elements of an agreeable character? Was it not Dr. Johnson who said that politeness was benevolence in trifles? If politeness be the offspring of good feeling evinced in social minutiae, tact as certainly springs from the amiability which is thoughtful to spare others pain. Many a woman, endowed with noble attributes and rich in sterling virtues, has passed through life little beloved, little appreciated, and seldom sought after, because she was lamentably deficient in this one conciliating, harmonizing quality of tact, because she always rendered those with whom she associated discontented with themselves, and that engendered discontent with her. A writer who evidently weighed the importance of the social art of making oneself acceptable to others by rendering others pleased with themselves, jocosely advises a man who has failed in inspiring a woman with love for him to fill her above the brim with love for herself, assuring him that all which runs over will be his. That counselor understood the value of the word tact. End of Tactless People by Anna Cora Mawat Ritchie. Read by Kelly Taylor.
Women and Holy Orders by the Right Reverend Arthur C. A. Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It is desirable clearly to define the purpose and limitations of this article. There is no intention to disparage or undervalue the work of women in the Church, nor to deal here with the distinct question of their participation in councils of the Church, whether parochial, diocesan, or other. The question to be considered is whether they are admissible to holy orders. 1. Authority might be thought to settle the question. St. Paul's words are certainly applicable. We have no such custom, neither the churches of God. 1 Corinthians 11:16. The committee appointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury to consider the ministry of women in their report, contained in a book bearing this title, say, "We find no evidence for the admission of women to the priesthood. Save among heretical or obscure sects, there have been no Christian priestesses." Montanus apparently allowed a woman to celebrate the Eucharist, but Tertullian's testimony to the practice of the Church, A.D. 200, is clear. It is not allowed to a woman to speak in church, nor yet to baptize or offer, nor to claim a share in any work of men, to say nothing of the sacerdotal office. Again, the committee make this summarizing statement. The 12 apostles were men, and the 70 who were sent forth to preach the kingdom were men. The sacrament of the Lord's Supper was instituted in the presence of the apostles only. The Apostolic Commission, recorded in John 20:19-23, was delivered to men. The evangelistic charge narrated in Matthew 28:16-20 would appear to have been delivered to the 11 disciples. These facts taken together are proof that there were functions and responsibilities which at the first our Lord assigned to men, and did not assign to women. As regards spiritual privilege, there was entire equality between the sexes. As regards religious vocation and public duties, there was no such identity. All branches of the Church have hitherto interpreted this testimony of the Gospels to mean that the government of the Church and the responsibility for the ministry of the Word and the sacraments were entrusted to men. In the face of these admissions, it may well be asked whether a national church, whatever exactly that may be, has the right on its own authority, or acting by itself, to make such an innovation on the general practice of the Catholic Church as admitting women to holy orders would be. Whether it has the right or not, it is certain that such action on the part of the Anglican communion would make an insuperable bar to reunion with other historic branches of the Catholic Church, which the committee of the Lambeth Conference urges we should do nothing to retard. That this would be the effect of such action is made abundantly clear in letters from representatives of the Greek and Russian churches in England, printed in the Church Times for December 31st, 1920. The Archimandrite of the Greek Church wrote, "My answer to the questions cannot but ground itself on the canons of the Church, which explicitly forbid women to take any active part in ministrations in Orthodox churches during the liturgy, or any other religious service performed in the presence of a mixed congregation of the faithful. The Roman Catholic Church adheres to the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, who, after weighing contrary arguments, including that based on the gift of prophecy to women, concludes that the male sex is required for the sacrament of orders, and that though all the ceremonies of ordination were performed in the case of a woman, she would not be ordained. Are we to follow the lead of the more radical of Protestant bodies, like the Universalists in this country, concerning whom the writer was told some years ago by one who had studied at Tufts College and had been a Universalist minister before seeking holy orders in the Church? 1. That practically all Universalists in New England were now Unitarian in belief, and 2. That there were more women than men in the divinity school at Tufts. That such an innovation would be contrary to the mind of the New Testament and of the early Church is beyond dispute. That it would be productive of further divisions and confusion is equally certain. 2. But it is pleaded that we must not allow ourselves to be hampered by the dead hand of tradition. It is to be shown, then, that authority is not arbitrary, but based on reason. So St. Paul bases his regulations and restrictions concerning women's behavior in church on A. the subordination of the female sex to the male, which is in no wise inconsistent with personal equality. B. On the different functions of men and women. C. On natural instinct as to what is proper and becoming. These sexes are differently constituted, physiologically and psychologically, and by these differences they are fitted for different kinds of work in church, as in the state and in the family. As a sex, women are not fitted for positions of rule and government. Their emotional, affectionate, and sympathetic temperament, however valuable in other ways, is a certain disqualification for the exercise of authority. A judicial, balanced, impartial, controlled temper and attitude is required, and ought to be found in those who hold the pastoral office. And these are not distinguishing characteristics of the female sex. The office of priest and pastor is distinctly that of a ruler. It is not chiefly concerned with speaking and preaching, nor with the mere administration of sacraments. The minister of the word and sacraments has a judicial office to enforce requirements and conditions for the church's privileges. The faithful and wise steward whom his Lord makes ruler over his household is a figure of the church's pastor. Moreover, we may certainly ask, if the priesthood may be conferred on women, why not the episcopate? If pastorship, why not chief pastorship, the chief rule in spiritual things over all men and women? It is oftentimes by working out arrangements to their fair possibilities that their inherent unworkableness and contradiction of principle is shown. We are referred to the institution of deaconesses as a warrant for admitting women to holy orders, but the point is that deaconesses are not in holy orders. They are to be regarded, historically and among ourselves, as officers or servants of the church commissioned for special work, as persons of old in minor orders, superior to, but like, lay readers appointed and licensed, rather than, in the stricter sense, ordained. The position and functions of deaconesses in the primitive church were uncertain, and they gradually disappeared as special needs for their assistance diminished at the baptism of women or in visiting those secluded from contact with men. Professor Cuthbert Turner, than whom there is no higher authority on early church history, has thus summed up the evidence concerning deaconesses in early times. 1. No woman ever undertook a public function in the face of the church, i.e., a mixed congregation. 2. No order of women ministers was ever universal, and an order of limited currency cannot be regarded, and has never in fact been regarded, as on a level with the orders universal in the church. In other words, deaconesses were not in holy orders. Bishop John Wordsworth, in his Ministry of Grace, says, "The practical development of deaconesses was confined to the East, and more particularly to such centers as Antioch and Constantinople, though it appears elsewhere. There is scarcely any mention of the office in the West in the first 4 centuries, and when it is afterwards noticed, it is usually with disfavor. The first mention of it at Rome seems to belong to the 8th century. With these limitations, we can entirely accept what is said in the report of the Archbishop's Committee. Notwithstanding local variations of practice and long disuse, it is beyond all question that the diaconate of women had a very real existence. There has been no decision of the Church as a whole against it. No council of importance has condemned it, and it is impossible to maintain that the disuse has been of so complete or decisive a nature as to render the revival of the order incompetent to any part of the Church. This was the line really taken by the Lambeth Conference, even if accompanied by some unfortunate suggestions concerning the ministrations of deaconesses. These recommendations, it should be noted, were adopted by a small majority of the bishops present at the time, 117 votes to 81, this majority being a minority of the members of the conference, 252. The conference distinctly refused to endorse the proposals of its committee on the subject, in direct divergence from the report of the committee, which said that the ordination of a deaconess confers upon her holy orders, and that she received the character of a deaconess. In the resolutions of the conference, the term holy orders was avoided in connection with deaconesses. Not only was it not used, but it was discarded. Authority to minister the chalice at a sick communion was refused to them, and any further advance beyond the diaconate was explicitly denied to women. Resolution 48 declared, "The office of a deacon is for women the only order in the ministry which has the stamp of apostolic approval, and is for women the only order of the ministry which we can recommend that our branch of the Catholic Church should recognize and use." In any appeal to the authority of Lambeth, while we may regret some things that were done or said about deaconesses, what was not done or said, though asked for and recommended by the committee, must be taken into account. The American Church, as I have said elsewhere, is not likely to change its stand in the matter, either in accounting deaconesses as in holy orders, or by withdrawing its rule that the deaconess must be unmarried or widowed, and that the office or appointment shall be vacated by marriage. 3. Leaving considerations of authority and reason, we pass to questions of expediency. A. Women, it is pleaded, demand such a change in old established discipline. A few do, some gifted, some restless and wilful, possessed with the idea that the equality of persons of both sexes involves the identity of their functions. But by the great majority of church women the idea is regarded with abhorrence. They have their own position, their own gifts and influence and opportunities, and they have no desire, perhaps at the loss of some of these, to intrude on masculine prerogatives. By no class of worshippers would such a change in our rules be more bitterly resented than by devout church women. Take a particular class of women that should not be ignored in such matters, those specially dedicated to the service of our Lord and His Church in religious communities. They are constant in worship. They value highly the sacramental life. They are diligent in spiritual as well as in corporal works of mercy. Do they desire to lead the general congregation in worship, to minister to the pulpit or at the altar, to be burdened with the charge of priesthood? B. And what would be the effect on men? Would they be won or further alienated from religion and religious observances, as these took on more and more of a feminine color and tone? Is not one common and not altogether groundless complaint now that we need a more virile presentation of Christianity in the pulpit and elsewhere? Will our efforts to recruit young men for the ministry be helped or hindered by the invitation being extended to their sisters and female friends? We lament now that we do not get the strongest men. Is this condition likely to be remedied by the association and competition of women with men in the ministry? C. Practical inconveniences have to be faced. Already in mixed juries difficulties have arisen in the presentation of evidence of a repulsive or indelicate nature. Would women priests hear the confession of men, or as bishops deal with cases of discipline in which sensual sins are involved? It is impossible to avoid the question of marriage. Must clergy women all be of a certain age? Shall they be unmarried? Unless distinctly set apart and known to be unmarriageable, grave inconveniences will arise. This is the crux of deaconesses. Some authorities expect a deaconess to remain unmarried, but earnestly protest against any vow or rule of celibacy which would serve as a protection. They throw the young deaconess into close association with young clergymen and young doctors, and then are disappointed and grieved if she abandons her intention. Is this fair to any of those concerned? If clergywomen are married, how are the rights of a husband and family to be harmonized with the demands of the ministry? How are the primary duties of motherhood to be fulfilled by these ordained women? Are they, as has been recommended in the case of deaconesses, to be dispensed for a time, and how often, from the exercise of their office, that they may bear and rear children, returning when these duties are fulfilled to the pastoral care? Surely this will not be a fresh reason, and on the part of religious leaders, for the restriction of families. These mere suggestions are sufficient to cover the whole proposal with ridicule. Two arguments in favor of the innovation must be noticed. One, the great differences in the status of women in the apostolic age and now. Two, that the same arguments which are used above were urged a while, and not so very long ago, against the admission of women to other professions, particularly those of medicine and surgery, of law, of politics. Now prejudice in these directions is largely overcome. In reply it may be asked, A, whether the general success of women, as distinct from a few exceptional instances, in these lines has been so marked as to encourage further ventures along other lines. B, do women doctors or surgeons practice to any extent among men? To have a distinct clergy for each sex would make a schism in the body of Christ deeper than that of Jew and Gentile. C, whatever may be said about women's capacity for employment in these secular professions, the objection to their ordination to the sacred ministry is based not on social conventions, but on deeply rooted distinctions implanted by nature between the sexes. There is an instinctive shrinking amounting to abhorrence from such proposals. As Catholic Christians, we repeat firmly, we have and will have no such custom. End of Women and Holy Orders by the Right Reverend Arthur C. A. Hall.